I'm working in the New Perspectives Microsoft Access 2010 textbook. I'm in Tutorial 5 and I'm beginning on page AC240 to create a crosstab query. Since this is our first venture into crosstab queries, many of you will probably believe that if there's a problem with the crosstab query results, that your problem is in the crosstab query itself. Actually, the problem often lies in the query that the crosstab query is built on. We very often will build a query as the basis for a crosstab query. It's vital that that query work properly. So before we begin with a crosstab query, we're going to find the QRY Customers and Invoices query and open it. We need to make sure that it opens properly. So here we have QRY Customers and Invoices. I'll open it up and see the fields that I have available in it. I also have 172 records in this query. That matches with the number of fields that I have in my invoice table. At this point in our textbook, we haven't gotten into working with outer join. We can assume that the query will have as many or fewer records than the largest table that is used to produce that query record set. So right now our source query is looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and build the crosstab query. So I'm going to click on Create. I'm going to do this with a query wizard. We can build a crosstab query using query design. At this point we're not going to do that. We just have not had enough exposure in our textbook to know how to build this specialized form of an aggregate query. So I'll click Query Wizard, click Crosstab Query, OK. And at this point I'm going to pick the source for my crosstab query. So I'll click the Queries Options button, find Customers and Invoices, and click Next. If at this point you should get a message that says that there are no fields in your query, what that means is your query hasn't been compiled. You'd simply cancel out of the wizard, go back to your source query and run it. Make sure that it opens properly. Now what we want in here is we want to show our row headings. Those are going to appear along the left side as city. Click Next. We want to show our column headings. These are the ones that are going to appear across the top as invoice paid. We'll click Next. We want to take the invoice amount and sum. I'll click Next, and then I'll go ahead and name this query, and I'm just going to take out the underscore here to match the directions that are in our textbook on page AC242, and click Finish. Now what we need to look at first is the -1 and 0. -1 in Access is yes. That would mean that the invoice has been paid. That invoice paid is equal to yes. 0 is no. Now it may be a little confusing because you're used to 1 being yes and 0 being no, but just keep in mind that 0 is no. This is a Boolean field. There can only be two options, yes and no, and if 0 is no, then the other one is yes. Now what I'm going to do is I want to change so that instead of saying -1 and 0, which is confusing, I want to say paid, unpaid. So I'm going to switch to Design View, and I'm going to go into my column heading, and I'm going to zoom on this so you can see easier what I'm doing. I'll up the font, and what I want to know is if invoice paid, then I want to mark it paid, else unpaid. So I'll just start in here by if, and this is the immediate if. IF is a reserved word in Access, so we need to use the immediate if, which is IIF. And it's a function, so it takes parentheses, if invoice paid, and by default it's equal to yes. If invoice paid, mark it paid. Otherwise, unpaid. This is the formula that you see in figure 5-23 on page 245. Instead of wiping out invoice paid and putting it back in, I just used the value that was already there. I'll click OK. It's going to name my field expression 1. I really don't need to give it a different name, and I'll run it to see how it looks. Paid, unpaid. Now we're going to go back into this and we're going to mess with it a little bit, because notice it says paid, unpaid. What I want you to note is that paid and unpaid, P and U, they're in alphabetical order. I'm going to come back here, and instead of saying paid and unpaid, I'm going to say paid and not paid. Notice how they switched places. Not paid, paid. Now, just to reassure you that the columns actually switched places, look at the dollar amount in this first row. Very large dollar amount, easy to recognize. $262,000 of outstanding invoices. So I'm going to come back, right click, go into Zoom again, and I'm going to change this back to unpaid. I'll run it again. Notice how they switch places. Now this is real important to understand, that my logic remains exactly the same. If the invoice is paid, enter the text paid. This is the logical comparison. This is what we're going to do if it's true. This is what we're going to do if it's false. I'll call this not paid again and run it. Notice it's in alphabetical order. The whole column switches position. So what we've looked at in this video is the importance of knowing that the underlying query works before you create the crosstab query that is based on that query. Understanding the logic of the formula, that the formula is set up so we have the comparison, and that is invoice paid. And just to try to help you see this more clearly, I'm going to say invoice paid equal yes. I don't have to say that because equal yes is there by default. This is the logical comparison. This is the true thing. This is the false thing. So if the invoice is paid, mark it paid. If it's not, if the invoice is not equal to paid, mark it unpaid. You have to follow the logic of the formula. I'll take this out, click OK, and we'll run it one more time. Now we're going to take a look at another crosstab query that seems to give people a lot of grief. And that is the one in case number 3. That crosstab query is on page AC280, beginning at step 8. I'm going to show you an example of the crosstab query. In this case, we see that the agency name is showing, the total of net donations, and the amount of the net donation if a pickup is required. The problem we're seeing in this query is that we don't know the amount of the net donations if a pickup is not required. This is not a problem with the crosstab query. This is a problem with the underlying query, the one that we created on page AC279, step 5. The part of this query that folks seem to miss, and we'll go over an open query, net donations. The part of this query that people seem to miss is removing the criteria right here. In step 5, about the middle of the paragraph, it says modify the new query to select all records, to display the net pickup field, and to sort only in descending order by net donation. You seem to get this one right and this one right, but miss this one. You have to remove the criteria. When I do that and run my query, I'm going to see a real difference here. Now I have 63 records. take a quick look at what it was before. 18. That'll be a huge difference. 63 records. I'm going to save and close. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to open up my Net Donations crosstab. My Net Donations crosstab query is now correct because it's going to pick up those records that are now showing because we removed the criteria. The other query, two queries basically, but one in particular that suffers from having an incorrect Net Donations query, is the multiple donor donations query. I'm going to go back into Net Donations and set this back to yes. Run it again, back to 18. Save it. I'm showing that there are only 2 records where there's a multiple donation. Let's go back into Net Donations. Remove the yes again so that all the records are showing, all 63 of them. Yes, and open up the multiple donor donations. Now we have 13, which is correct. So the problem in case problem 3 is usually not the crosstab query. It's the Net Donations query. When you create that query, make sure that you have removed the criteria from the pickup required field. If you don't remove that, it's going to appear that your crosstab query is not working. And it is not a problem with a crosstab query often. It is a problem with the underlying query, the query that you use to build the crosstab query.